Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to directly discriminate in housing, employment, and accommodations based on race, America's neighborhoods and schools still remain quite segregated in the 2020s. The number one reason for that is a tactic called redlining. In today's video, the issue of redlining, we're going to learn what redlining is, how it persists, and how we as Americans can combat this form of systemic racism. But first, I want to warmly and appropriately greet you depending on whether or not you've seen my videos before. If you have, I appreciate your loyalty and viewership, especially if you've joined my subscriber base and have clicked on the bell for notifications. If you're new, welcome to the Autistic Advocate. I hope today's video gets you wanting more of what I have to offer, which you can get by subscribing and clicking the bell icon. So what does redlining mean and how does it work? Redlining is essentially when mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial services are systematically denied to people living in an area with a large population of color. Those who commit this act tend to put forth that the neighborhood they live in is dangerous and has a high crime rate. These individuals are denied services without any regard to their qualifications and creditworthiness. Redlining can range anywhere from excluding certain neighborhoods from opening bank accounts to withholding much more essential services such as grocery stores or hospitals. So where does redlining all go back? The original redliners were the National Association of Real Estate Boards, or NAREB, who based their sales practices on theories about race and property values codified by economists surrounding Richard T. Ely and his Institute for Research in Land Economics and Public Utilities, founded at the University of Wisconsin in 1920. The process of redlining was officially put into practice 14 years later with the passing of the National Housing Act. The Federal Housing Association's formalized redlining process was developed by their chief land economist, Homer Hoyt, as part of an initiative to develop the first underwriting criteria for mortgages. If you know anything about the social scene of those times, it's that racial segregation in all of its forms was at its peak with the enforcement of Jim Crow laws. Well, redlining was the glue that held those policies together. In 1935, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, or FHLBB, asked the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, to look at 239 cities and create residential security maps to indicate the level of security for real estate investments in each surveyed city. On the maps, the newest areas, those considered desirable for lending purposes, were outlined in green and known as Type A. These were typically affluent suburbs on the outskirts of cities. Type B neighborhoods, outlined in blue, were considered still desirable, whereas older Type C neighborhoods were labeled declining and outlined in yellow. Type D neighborhoods were outlined in red and were considered the most risky for mortgage support, hence the name redlining. While about 85% of the residents of such neighborhoods were white, they included most of the African American urban households. These neighborhoods tended to be the older districts in the center of cities. Often they were also African American neighborhoods, and only 6 majority African American neighborhoods in the entire United States were not evaluated as Type D. Banks and mortgage lenders weren't the only private entities to develop redlining practices. Property insurance companies also instituted rigid redlining policies in the post-World War II period. According to urban historian Bench Ansfield, the post-war advent of comprehensive homeowners insurance was limited to the suburbs and withheld from neighborhoods of color in U.S. cities. One Aetna bulletin from 1964 advised underwriters to use a red line around questionable areas on territorial maps. The New York Urban Coalition warned in 1978, a neighborhood without insurance is a neighborhood doomed to death. Redlining officially became illegal in 1974 by Chicago's Metropolitan Area Housing Authority, or MAHA, made up of representatives of local organizations. NPA and its affiliates achieved disclosure of lending practices with the passage of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975. It required transparency, and review of loan practices began to change lending practices. But even to this day, redliners find ways around these laws, and they have profound effects on low-income communities of color. What are these effects exactly? If it doesn't go without saying, denying services to people in low-income neighborhoods primarily of color keeps them in poverty rather than helping them move up the ladder. But this doesn't exactly happen all at once. A multi-generational study on upward mobility trends in American cities concluded that black men who grew up in racially segregated neighborhoods were substantially less likely to gain upward economic mobility, finding black children born to parents in the bottom household income quintile have a 2.5% chance of rising to the top quintile of household income, compared with 10.6% for whites. Because of this intergenerational poverty, black households are stuck in place and are less able to grow wealth. Black families in America earn just $57.30 for every $100 in income earned by white families, according to the Census Bureau's current population survey. For every $100 in white family wealth, black families hold just $5.04. Now that's a pretty big discrepancy. You'd think that in post-racial America, the black-white wealth gap would have been resolved following the Great Recession, but it didn't. Simply put, when you discriminate against bad neighborhoods like that, those neighborhoods only get worse. A diminished quality of health is an inevitable consequence of poverty, and those put in that place via redlining are no exception. Wealth affords the privilege of living in a neighborhood or community with clean air, pure water, outdoor spaces, and places for recreation and exercise, safe streets during the day and night, and infrastructure that supports the growth of intergenerational wealth through access to good schools, healthy food, public transportation, and opportunities to connect, belong, and contribute to the surrounding community. A good example of this is the disproportionate effects that COVID-19 has had on the same communities which the Hulk redlined in the 1930s. Research published in September 2020 overlaid maps of the highly affected COVID-19 areas with the Hulk maps, showing that those areas marked risky to lenders because they contained minority residents were the same neighborhoods most affected by COVID-19. The CDC points to discrimination within healthcare, education, criminal justice, housing, and finance as direct results of systematically subversive tactics like redlining, which led to chronic and toxic stress that shaped social and economic factors for minority groups, increasing their risk for COVID-19. Educational, income, and wealth gaps that result from this isolation mean that minority groups' limited access to the job market may force them to remain in fields that have a higher risk of exposure to the virus without options to take time off. Finally, a direct result of redlining is the overcrowding of minority groups into neighborhoods that do not boast adequate housing to sustain burgeoning populations, leading to crowded conditions where it's nearly impossible to stay 6 feet apart. So how do we tackle this problem? There's actually an organization dedicated to combating redlining and its adverse effects called Shore Bank. It's named for its home in Chicago's South Shore neighborhood, and its goal is to address racist lending practices in Chicago's African American communities by providing financial services, especially mortgage loans, to local residents. Some might say that this only treats a symptom, but this isn't necessarily the case. It may not get to the root of redlining, but if nothing else, it sends the message that neighborhoods of color deserve better. This is just one example of an organization helping clean up the mess made by redlining. There are many more things that can be done on both individual and group levels. That's right, you can help reverse the effects of redlining by doing things like recognizing and spreading awareness of the importance of public transportation as a means for low-income communities to access jobs and services, investing in the housing stock through neighborhood revitalization programs, voting in favor of inclusionary zoning ordinances to improve amounts of high-quality housing, and writing letters persuading politicians to equitably distribute hazardous waste sites so they are not concentrated in low-income and minority areas. Redlining is scary because it oppresses minorities in such a slow, quiet way. But becoming aware of it is the first step to making things better. If you think I talked about this issue in a sensitive, articulate way, you can hear even more of that by checking out other content of mine and subscribing and clicking the bell like I told you to. If you'd like to see videos similar to these but in different niches, check out 2 other channels I have by clicking the links on your screen. Hope you'll come back to see more of my content sometime soon.